A breeze, scented faintly of lavender and smoke, stirred the silk ribbons hanging from the high balconies of Arlowick Square. Below, the crowd moved like a painted current, parasols tilting, boots clicking, voices murmuring in layers of artful boredom. The afternoon procession had paused at the gates of the Duke's townhouse, where liveried servants stood in unreadable formation, and ladies of fortune fanned themselves with deliberate elegance. Yet amidst all the practiced laughter and measured steps, one thing did not belong. It was a voice. Soft at first, so easily mistaken for wind through the ironwork, or a violin's sigh from the salon window. But no. It rose again, clearer this time, perfectly in tune, floating above the din like a string of pearls caught on light. It was not trained, not court-polished, but it held a raw purity that silenced breath. The Prince, His Royal Highness Frederick James Altham, paused with one gloved hand on the crest-engraved rail of his open carriage. His gaze, steel grey and used to admiration, narrowed, not at the Duchess whose voice trilled for attention beside him, nor at the heralds calling his titles, but toward the alley behind the kitchens, where, just beyond the edge of notice, a barefoot girl stood singing to a loaf of bread. She could not have been more than 16. Her gown was no more than muslin worn to gauze at the hems, stained with ash and stitched with hands too young for such hardship. Her hair, dark as soot and tangled at the nape, fell unbound over her shoulders, and yet she sang, not in desperation, but with a kind of fragile defiance. Each note was offered to the air like a promise she didn't expect to keep. No one looked, not the ladies with diamond combs, nor the officers with polished sabres. The crowd passed by her as if she were a cracked tile in the road, but the Prince did not. He watched her with the same expression he wore at court dinners when a foreign dish surprised him, curious, disarmed, and somehow distantly wounded. Lady Celestine Norwood, seated beside him, noticed his distraction. "Your Highness," she said sweetly, her voice edged with suspicion, "shall I have the footman clear the noise?" He didn't answer. His eyes remained on the girl. She finished her song. Silence fell. A child, younger than she, likely her brother, touched her arm and pointed to the loaf a baker had just handed over, more out of pity than payment. She bowed her head, not to beg, to thank. The carriage moved on, but the Prince turned once more in his seat, his posture still and quiet, as though he had just glimpsed something neither he nor the rest of the world had been meant to see. He did not speak of it at dinner, nor during the speeches. But later, as his valet prepared his coat for the evening's masquerade, the Prince asked, too casually, if the kitchens kept a register of those who scavenged nearby. A foolish question, he was told. No such thing existed, and yet the next morning, before even the steeple bells had rung for prime, a discreet inquiry had been issued under the seal of the Crown, asking for the names of any street girls known to frequent Arlowick Square, particularly those who could sing. No reply came for days, but the Prince waited, and remembered the way her voice had caught in his chest like a secret never meant to be spoken aloud. The chandeliers of Wexford Hall gleamed like frozen fireworks above the heads of the noble assembly. Gold thread caught the candlelight on bodices, epaulettes, and the trimmed folds of silk gowns rustling in time with a waltz that pulsed through the room like a heartbeat pretending not to feel. Prince Frederick stood among the glittering guests, his uniform faultless, his features carved in the noble stillness he had perfected over years of observation. But his mind was elsewhere, not on the Dowager Countess of Billinghurst, who prattled about the placement of orchids in the conservatory, not on the second daughter of the Marquis of Astley, who kept finding reasons to brush her hand against his sleeve. He was listening, not to the quartet near the stage, but to something beneath, or rather the absence of something. He hadn't heard it again. That voice, that tune that had startled him like a poem found in the margins of a soldier's letter. No whisper of it had reached him since that afternoon at Arlowick Square, and though he did not mention it, he found himself measuring every voice in every room against the memory of that barefoot girl's song. Lady Celestine, whose confidence bloomed under candlelight like a night orchid, stood beside him now, her gloved hand lightly resting on his. "You seem distracted, Your Highness. Shall I worry?" He looked at her, perfect in form, in title, in destiny. But her voice, though trained and pleasing, lacked soul. It fell from her lips like a coin placed neatly on a table, expected, polished, and ultimately cold. "No need," he replied smoothly. "It is only the heat." She smiled, falsely, and turned back to the dance, her interest shifting to Lord Percy's inheritance. Across the hall, unnoticed by all, a girl in a plain grey frock with cuffs slightly frayed stood near the wall, a tray of flutes balanced delicately on one hand. Her eyes were cast downward as instructed, and her sleeves rolled just enough to show the edge of an old scar on her forearm. Her name, if one asked, was Margaret, but she had once been Maggie to a dying mother and Magpie to the little brother she now fed with bread bought in song. No one asked. Not the ladies who took flutes without a glance, nor the gentleman who spoke over her head as if she were furniture. Until Lord Everett, bloated with port and bored of decorum, paused to murmur something under his breath, crude, lazy, and cruel. He reached for a glass, his fingers brushing her wrist as if claiming the right to do so. Maggie flinched, not outwardly, for that would invite punishment, but in her breath, which caught as if frozen mid-note. Across the room, Prince Frederick turned his head. For a moment he thought, perhaps, he had imagined her. But there she was, the girl with the ash-dark hair now tied back in a modest ribbon, her eyes lowered but not vacant. He watched as she moved with silent precision, placing glasses, avoiding eyes, becoming air. The orchestra swelled, laughter rose, and he, a royal trained in the art of invisible judgment, felt an unfamiliar ripple beneath his composure. He had found her, but to speak to her now would be unthinkable. Herr Prince does not chase scullery girls through candlelit halls, especially not with half the nobility of England watching his every nod. Still, he could not look away, not even when Lady Celestine tugged gently on his arm. "Frederick," she whispered with an intimate entitlement, "are you well?" He gave a practiced smile. "Perfectly." But behind his eyes the memory stirred, of a barefoot girl singing for bread and a silence that had followed him into every ballroom since. A breeze, scented faintly of lavender and smoke, stirred the silk ribbons hanging from the high balconies of Alnwick Square. Below, the crowd moved like a painted current, parasols tilting, boots clicking, voices murmuring in layers of artful boredom. The afternoon procession had paused at the gates of the Duke's townhouse, where liveried servants stood in unreadable formation, and ladies of fortune fanned themselves with deliberate elegance. Yet amidst all the practiced laughter and measured steps, one thing did not belong. It was a voice. Soft at first, so easily mistaken for wind through the ironwork or a violin's sigh from the salon window. But no. It rose again, clearer this time, perfectly in tune, floating above the din like a string of pearls caught on light. It was not trained, not court-polished, but it held a raw purity that silenced breath. The Prince, His Royal Highness Frederick James Altham, paused with one gloved hand on the crest-engraved rail of his open carriage. His gaze, steel-grey and used to admiration, narrowed, not at the Duchess whose voice trilled for attention beside him, nor at the heralds calling his titles, but toward the alley behind the kitchens, where, just beyond the edge of notice, a barefoot girl stood singing to a loaf of bread. She could not have been more than 16. Her gown was no more than muslin worn to gauze at the hems, stained with ash and stitched with hands too young for such hardship. Her hair, dark as soot and tangled at the nape, fell unbound over her shoulders, and yet she sang, not in desperation, but with a kind of fragile defiance. Each note was offered to the air like a promise she didn't expect to keep. No one looked, not the ladies with diamond combs, nor the officers with polished sabres. The crowd passed by her as if she were a cracked tile in the road, but the Prince did not. He watched her with the same expression he wore at court dinners when a foreign dish surprised him, curious, disarmed, and somehow distantly wounded. Lady Celestine Norwood, seated beside him, noticed his distraction. "Your Highness," she said sweetly, her voice edged with suspicion, "shall I have the footman clear the noise?" He didn't answer. His eyes remained on the girl. She finished her song. Silence fell. A child, younger than she, likely her brother, touched her arm and pointed to the loaf a baker had just handed over, more out of pity than payment. She bowed her head, not to beg, to thank. The carriage moved on, but the prince turned once more in his seat, his posture still and quiet, as though he had just glimpsed something neither he nor the rest of the world had been meant to see. He did not speak of it at dinner, nor during the speeches. But later, as his valet prepared his coat for the evening's masquerade, the prince asked, too casually, if the kitchens kept a register of those who scavenged nearby. A foolish question, he was told. No such thing existed. And yet the next morning, before even the steeple bells had rung for prime, a discreet inquiry had been issued under the seal of the Crown, asking for the names of any street girls known to frequent Arlowick Square, particularly those who could sing. No reply came for days, but the prince waited, and remembered the way her voice had caught in his chest like a secret never meant to be spoken aloud. Rain came the next morning, not in torrents but in the slow, deliberate drizzle that coated the stone streets and made the gas lamps flicker with a tired melancholy. The city woke with its usual complaints, wheels turning over wet cobblestones, market cries muffled by cloaks, chimney smoke curling toward a reluctant sky. But in the upper corridors of Wexford Hall, a different kind of stir had begun. His Royal Highness Prince Frederick sat before the tall windows of his guest chamber, his breakfast untouched. The paper had arrived, folded, pressed, and steaming faintly from the courier's hand. He barely glanced at the headlines. His attention was on a small envelope that rested to one side, unsealed, but marked by a wax stamp he recognized, the discreet insignia of Mr. Thorne, the Crown's preferred solicitor for delicate inquiries. Inside, a single sheet, hand-copied and concise. Margaret Eleanor Blythe, age 17. Servant employed at Wexford Hall, orphaned, brother in care at Greywick Parish Home, no criminal record, known locally for voice, untrained. Former resident of Penhurst Estate until age 9, daughter of Miss Eleanor Blythe, deceased governess to the Penhurst family. The prince read the lines once, then again. He did not smile, but his fingers curled slowly around the edge of the paper, as if holding something both precious and volatile. Margaret Blythe. The name fit the memory, fragile, direct, and undeservedly forgotten. At the desk nearby, his valet coughed softly, not to rush him, but to remind him of the schedule. The afternoon meeting with the foreign attaché, the ribbon-cutting ceremony at St. Philip's Orphan Hospital, the gala dinner in honor of General Tavistock. The prince stood abruptly. "Cancel the hospital visit." "Your Highness?" The valet blinked. "I said cancel it. Inform them I'll make a private donation in lieu." The valet hesitated. "Shall I prepare an alternate appearance?" "No." Frederick's tone was final. Then, more softly, "Send for Mr. Thorne. Today." Meanwhile, downstairs in the servants' wing, Maggie knelt by a brass kettle, polishing the handle until she could see her own reflection, pale, strained, with circles beneath her eyes that no rouge would hide. She had barely slept. The prince had seen her, and not merely glanced, seen her. She could feel the echo of it, like a warmth left on her cheek. Her mind raced with implications, dangers, absurd hopes. She had not spoken a word of it, not even to little Toby, who was now safe, barely, in the parish home she visited with smuggled pastries and lullabies whispered through a cracked door. But she had written something. 3 nights ago, before the ball. A letter, folded and hidden behind a loose stone near the pantry hearth, addressed not to the prince, of course not, but to someone who might reach him. Lady Agnes Penhurst. It had taken her days to gather the nerve, weeks to find someone who still remembered her mother's name and who might whisper a favour into the right ear. Lady Agnes had once loved her like a sister, had wept when Maggie left the estate in disgrace. Perhaps, all these years later, she might remember. The letter had been simple. Just a few lines, formal yet pleading. "My lady, forgive the intrusion. If you remember Maggie, Magpie, I am still in service, and surviving. I do not ask for place or pity, only that if your ladyship might..." might mention me in a way that keeps me safe. She had not signed it fully, only MB, but it had felt like flinging a stone across a chasm in the hope it reached the other side. She did not know that the letter had indeed reached Lady Agnes, and that Lady Agnes, grown into a quiet and reflective woman, had sat with it for hours before folding it into her prayer book and writing to her old childhood companion, His Royal Highness. Now, upstairs, the prince knew, and downstairs Maggie remained unaware, but not untouched, because that morning, as she passed through the hallway with a pitcher of hot water, a footman she'd never spoken to stepped aside, tipped his head, and said gently, "Morning, Miss Blythe." She stopped. He walked on, as if it were nothing, but her heart stilled, her name, spoken like it mattered, and she felt, deep beneath fear and disbelief, that something had begun. Wexford Hall hosted another gathering that evening, not a grand ball but a political supper, where lords leaned close to whisper promises over veal, and duchesses steered conversation like ships through stormy waters of inheritance and alliance. It was the sort of night where the candles burned too long, the smiles too wide, and the truth sat shivering in the shadows. The prince entered late. His arrival, though unannounced, sent a ripple through the dining room. He was not expected. His presence made the Viscount of Larksmere nearly drop his wine. Lady Celestine rose at once, arms extended as if greeting a returning general, but the prince only nodded, offering no explanation. Instead, he moved to the side of the room, near the fire where the footman stood with fresh decanters, and the maidservants rotated in and out with the ease of practiced invisibility. All except one. Maggie stood just beyond the archway, holding a tray of small game pies. Her eyes locked on him before she could stop herself, and then swiftly she looked down, but the moment had passed. He had seen her. He crossed the room, not quickly but with intention, and stood before the Viscount of Larksmere, who had just begun a pompous anecdote about the price of colonial sugar. "Forgive the interruption," Frederick said, voice quiet but firm, "but I must request a moment of clarity." The table hushed. Lord Larksmere blinked. "Your Highness?" "You employ a staff of 34, do you not?" the prince asked, gesturing vaguely toward the doorway. Yes, I believe so. "And yet you've never met the girl who serves your table every night." The prince's gaze flicked to Maggie. "You and half the titled men here have eaten from her hands and never thought to ask her name." The silence grew colder than the cream soup. Lady Celestine laughed too loudly. "Oh, Frederick, come now. Surely the girl is happy to serve. That's what they do, and it's their station." Maggie stood frozen. The pies trembled slightly on the tray. The prince turned. "Miss Margaret Blythe!" Gasps. He did not shout the name. He did not need to. It cut through the conversation like a scalpel. Maggie's breath caught. The tray nearly slipped, but she recovered with a grace that should have belonged to a duchess. "She is not a stranger," he continued, his voice steady. "She is the daughter of Eleanor Blythe, once governess to the Penhurst family, and known across Surrey for her education and dignity, until, as many of you surely recall, she was cast out on false charges that were never substantiated." No one moved. No one dared speak. He turned his gaze now to Lady Agnes Penhurst, seated near the end of the table, her face pale but proud. "I have received through her a letter," the prince continued, "written with care, humility, and no request for favor. Only safety." He paused. "And yet somehow I find myself wondering how such a voice and such grace has gone unnoticed for years in this very house." Maggie's cheeks burned. Her knees threatened to give way. Lord Everett, red with wine and self-importance, broke the silence with a huff. "Your Highness, surely we don't need to elevate every serving girl with a sob story." Frederick turned, eyes flashing. "Then perhaps, Lord Everett, you might explain the nature of your remarks to Miss Blythe the evening of the Wexford ball?" Lord Everett paled. I said nothing." "Several witnesses heard you," Frederick replied coolly. "If need be, I'll ask them to speak. But that is not my intent." He looked again at Maggie, this time not as a prince to a servant, but as a man to a woman he wished the room would forget. "I only wish the truth to be seen," he said softly, because too often it is not. A silence like snowfall settled. Lady Agnes rose. "Miss Blythe," she said, her voice calm but steady, "your mother taught me to read and to think. I have lived in shame of my silence for years. Tonight, I wish to correct it, not in whispers, but in the company of those who once stood by while she was ruined." She walked toward Maggie, the skirts of her gown rustling like parchment. Gently, she took the tray from her trembling hands and set it on the sideboard. Then she turned to the room. "She is my guest now." It was done, not with a shout nor with a royal decree, but with the quiet power of truth finally spoken aloud. And in that silence, Maggie stood, no longer a ghost in linen, but a girl with a name, a memory, and a place. The moment after truth is spoken is never quiet for long. Voices rose like startled birds, some incredulous, some irritated, some simply baffled that a servant girl could become the subject of a prince's declaration. The guests who moments before had been immersed in port and pheasant now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to feign amusement or outrage. It was not only the impropriety of the moment that unsettled them, it was the echo it might leave in drawing rooms across England. A servant, seen, a girl, spoken of in the same breath as nobility. Unacceptable. Lord Everett was the first to recover from his stunned silence. He pushed himself up from the table, face flushed with wine and embarrassment. "With all due respect, Your Highness," he said, voice taut, "there must be some misunderstanding. That girl is a kitchen maid. Nothing more. To parade her before the court like what exactly?" Frederick interrupted, eyes sharp. Everett faltered. "Well, like someone who belongs in our world." Frederick stepped forward. "Do you know the world she belongs to? Do you know what it takes to survive as she has? With dignity intact, with her brother alive, with nothing but the memory of a mother who once served your kind with grace." "I think we are all quite sensitive to the plight of the poor," muttered Lady Celestine, her voice lined with condescension. "But there are protocols. Elevating a maid simply because she can carry a tune—" The prince's voice cut across hers. "Because she can carry a tune, yes. And because she wrote a letter, not asking for favor, but asking not to be punished for being remembered." He turned now to Lady Agnes, who stood unmoving, her expression unreadable. "Lady Agnes received that letter," he continued, his voice quieter now. "And she answered it, not with pity, but with recognition. And I thank her for it." Lady Agnes bowed her head in solemn agreement. Across the room murmurs began, some sympathetic, others clearly appalled. "She's a bastard, isn't she?" someone whispered. "She's a fraud," hissed another. "She's dangerous," added Lady Marchwick, eyes narrowed. "Dangerous to order." Maggie, who had remained still all this time, felt her legs begin to tremble. Not from fear. She had known fear in the dark nights at the parish home, in the sound of a lock clicking when no one remembered she existed. This was different. This was visibility, and visibility burned. But she would not flinch. Then, from the far end of the room, a new voice joined the fray, calm but unmistakably firm. "If the girl is a fraud," said Mr. Thorne, the solicitor, who had arrived quietly and stood now near the entrance, "then it will be easily proven. But I have here a document signed and sealed by the late Eleanor Blythe, kept in the archives of the Penhurst estate, naming Margaret Eleanor Blythe as her legitimate daughter, born in service, but born of love and law." Gasps rippled through the hall. The solicitor stepped forward and presented a folded paper, the wax seal still unbroken. "I was instructed to bring this," he said, "should the truth be questioned." Frederick took the document, glanced at the seal and handed it without flourish to Lady Agnes. She opened it, hands steady, voice quiet as she read. "It's true," she said. "It was hidden after my father dismissed her. I found it in my mother's desk only last year." She looked up, tears brimming but unshed. "She's not a bastard. She's not a fraud. She's Maggie, and we let her be forgotten." The silence that followed was heavy. No one dared challenge a document. Not one bearing the Penhurst seal, not with the Crown watching. Lady Celestine stepped back into the shadows, her smile replaced by calculation. Lord Everett sank into his chair, glaring at his glass. The room had changed, not entirely, not permanently, but like a curtain pulled back to show that sunlight had always been waiting. Frederick turned once more to Maggie, and for the first time he offered a hand. He did not touch her. That would have been too much, too soon. But the gesture, open and visible, was louder than any ballroom whisper. "Miss Blythe," he said, "would you care to join us at the table?" A pause. Then Maggie, heart beating like thunder in her ears, gave the smallest of nods. She stepped forward, and the tray, once her burden and was left behind, left. Maggie took her place at the long table with the stiffness of someone walking on glass. Her palms were damp, her breath shallow, the silk-covered chairs, the glittering crystal, the heavy silver. They seemed hostile, foreign. It was not just fear that gripped her. It was something deeper. A lifetime of internalized silence was being broken, and the sound of it echoed in her bones. The prince sat beside her, composed but alert, like a man who had just walked through fire and knew the smell would cling to him for days. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Lady Agnes reached across the table, not for show, not for approval, but simply to touch Maggie's hand. Her eyes, no longer clouded with guilt, now held something else, something like penance. "I should have come for you," she whispered. "I thought of you often. I told myself it would cause more harm than help, but I was wrong." Maggie could not speak. Her throat tightened, but she nodded once, a tear sliding down her cheek despite every effort. A plate was set before her. The butler did not look down at her with disdain, but with the soft surprise of a man seeing a child he once passed over, now seated among kings. At the far end of the table, Lady Celestine stood suddenly, the legs of her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "I think I shall retire," she said, her voice clipped. "Celestine," Frederick began, his tone almost weary. But she raised her hand, eyes glittering with tightly restrained fury. "No need. It's clear where your attentions lie." She curtsied. Too low, too sharp. As she walked away, whispers followed her. One duke leaned in to another. "I hear she was promised the summer proposal," he muttered. "Not after tonight," came the reply. A second departure followed. Lord Everett, red-faced and silent, threw his napkin down and stalked out, offering neither apology nor acknowledgement. His pride, bruised in public, would not recover easily. But not everyone left. Lady Agnes remained, as did several others, Lord Carrow, whose daughters had once sung with Maggie, the Marchioness of Dunstable, who had lost her own title in scandal years before and knew too well what silence could cost, and old Sir Henry, half-deaf and wholly indifferent to gossip, who merely asked for another serving of lamb and offered Maggie a wink. Gradually conversation resumed, hesitant, then warmer. But Maggie barely tasted the food. She was surrounded by silver and silk, but all she could think of was the worn hem of her old apron, her brother's face behind the bars of Greywick's gate, the sound of her mother's laugh under the Penhurst linden trees. And then the worst happened. A soft cry came from the side of the room. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lane, always stern, always composed, had crumpled to the floor. Servants rushed forward, but it was Maggie who moved first, dropping her fork, kneeling beside the older woman without hesitation. "She's breathing," Maggie said quickly, steadying her. "Get her water, gently now." Frederick crouched beside her. "You know what to do." Maggie nodded. "My mother taught me. She collapsed once too, I remember. It's the heart." The housekeeper's eyes fluttered open. Her voice was thin. I didn't know who you were. I was hard on you." Maggie shook her head. "You did what you were told. I don't blame you." Mrs. Lane's eyes welled with tears. "You should." A servant brought water. Maggie held it gently to the woman's lips. The nobility watched in stunned quiet. It was not the drama they had expected, but something worse, something real. Humanity. The moment passed. The housekeeper was carried to the guest chambers. Maggie stood slowly, hands trembling now. The glamour of the table was shattered, and she had never felt more exposed. Frederick placed a hand over hers, not to guide her, but to steady her. "Let me take you from here," he said softly. She looked at him. You can't. I can. No, she whispered. Not yet. He bowed his head, accepting the truth. For even when a girl is seen, and even when her name is cleared, the wound of being forgotten does not heal in a single supper. Nor does the heart leap into comfort merely because a prince finally looked down and said her name. Maggie turned back toward the guests. I am grateful, she said quietly, for those who stayed, but I must ask your leave. And she walked out, not through the servants' hall but through the front entrance, her step steady, her eyes dry. She needed air. She needed time. And behind her, the table remained, a throne of crystal and shame, forever changed. The carriage sent by the prince waited outside Wexford Hall, its dark lacquer glistening with recent rain. It bore no crest, no fanfare, just a plain black door with brass trim and a driver who did not ask questions. Maggie stood beside it, her fingers curled in the folds of the shawl Lady Agnes had insisted she take, the same shawl she had once seen tossed over a chair in the drawing-room of Penhurst, never dreaming it would touch her skin. But she did not climb in. Not yet. The air was thick with the scent of damp lilac and coal. London's heartbeat still pulsed in the distance, wheels grinding, bells tolling, laughter somewhere far off, from a life that never noticed girls like her. She could hear the murmurs from behind the Wexford doors even now. They would twist the story into something palatable, something that made them feel merciful. The poor dear, they would say. Imagine, sitting at the table with us, and she didn't even spill her drink. She took a breath, deep, slow. The front door creaked open behind her. Footsteps, hesitant. Lady Agnes emerged, a cape drawn tight over her shoulders, her expression straining with hope. I thought you might have already gone, she said softly. I meant to, Maggie replied. They stood in the gaslight's dim wash, two women from two different fates, bound by one broken past. I want you to come to Penhurst, Lady Agnes said, as my guest, not as a servant. Maggie looked away. I don't know who I am there. You're Maggie, she said gently. You never stopped being her. My father's cruelty does not define your blood, nor your right to be seen. I was invisible for so long, Maggie whispered. It's hard to believe any of this is real. It is, said another voice. Frederick stood by the iron gate now, his coat unbuttoned, his face bare to the cold. There was no crown on him, just a man who had heard a voice and never forgotten it. I did not bring you into that room to make a spectacle of you, he said, walking toward them. I did it because I was ashamed, that it took me hearing you sing, just once, to realize how many voices I had never truly listened to. Maggie turned to face him. What do you want of me? He hesitated. Nothing. The honesty of it startled her. I came to see if you were well, he continued, and to say this, if you ever choose to leave this city, this life, it should be your choice, not mine, not theirs. The carriage door remained open, but Maggie looked past it, toward the narrow alley behind the estate where she had once wiped soot from her arms before serving cold roast duck to men who couldn't remember what room they'd eaten it in. I have to see Toby, she said. He's still at Greywick. I promised him jam tarts this Sunday. I never break my promises. Lady Agnes nodded. Then we'll go together. No, Maggie said, lifting her chin. This time I go alone. There was no anger in her voice, just certainty. The carriage would wait. The prince would wait. Even the world for once might wait. As she turned from the estate, her shoes silent on the wet cobblestone, no one stopped her. No one dared, because something had shifted, not just in the court or the hall, but in her. She no longer needed a place at the table to prove she belonged. She had chosen to walk away, and in that choice, she claimed more power than any crown could offer. Inside the carriage, untouched, lay a sealed envelope bearing the royal insignia. A letter she had not yet read. It would keep. Tonight, Maggie would visit her brother, and tomorrow, whatever came, she would meet it with open eyes and an upright spine. 3 days passed. Long, damp, unsettled days in the capital where the streets whispered the scandal in every turn of carriage wheels and hush of silk skirts. Wexford Hall's staff moved quietly now, as if even the clatter of plates might summon the ghost of that supper. The girl who had once polished floors now seated among dukes. The prince who had spoken her name with the weight of a promise. Lady Celestine Norwood, humiliated not by rejection but by irrelevance, departed London for her aunt's estate in Shropshire under the veil of a sudden illness of the nerves. Her name, once spoken beside the prince's with certainty, no longer passed easily through drawing-room conversations. Where she once graced the guest lists of every major event, her cards now remained unopened. Hosts whispered, "It would be awkward." Lord Everett, who had left the hall in seething silence, issued a carefully worded letter to the press denying impropriety and accusing certain unnamed individuals of social manipulation. But Mr. Thorne, the Crown's solicitor, responded with a single line, "The truth is not obliged to flatter you." Lady Agnes Penhurst returned to her estate quietly. She requested her staff to prepare the east wing, once occupied by her mother, long left unused, and instructed the housekeeper to air out the nursery. "We will have visitors," she said, "perhaps more than one." The staff did not question her, but the village of Penhurst buzzed, and Maggie she did not vanish as some hoped she might, nor did she accept the prince's invitation, not yet. Instead she walked through London as herself, no longer in servant grey nor in borrowed finery, but in a plain navy dress stitched from her mother's old patterns, mended at the cuffs. She passed through markets where she once sang for bread, this time purchasing it with her own coin. When the baker who once tossed crumbs at her feet saw her, his mouth opened, but no words came. She merely nodded, not cruelly, but like one who no longer needed retribution. At Greywick Parish Home, she was no longer forced to wait behind the iron gate. The matron led her through the main door, offered tea she didn't drink, and said with a tremble, "You'll take him soon, I imagine." Maggie knelt before Toby, now 7 and all legs and elbows, his eyes wide with questions. "Will we live in a palace now?" he asked. She smiled. "No. We'll live in a place where no one knocks unless they're welcome." "Will I go to school?" "You'll go wherever you wish." He blinked. "And what will you be?" Maggie paused. "Free." Back in the city, the prince received no reply to the letter he had written. He read it twice, debating whether to send another, perhaps shorter, perhaps less raw, but chose instead to wait. He had seen something in her walk as she left Wexford Hall, not fear, not haste, but purpose, and purpose cannot be rushed. On the 4th day, a change came. The postmaster at the royal residence brought a letter, addressed not to the prince but to Lady Agnes, sealed in the simplest brown paper, unsigned. It read, "I will come, not to be kept but to choose, not to be raised but to stand beside. I'll bring Toby, I'll bring the letter, and I'll bring the truth whether it's welcomed or not. A table is only noble when it makes space." Let us begin there. There was no name, but the handwriting was unmistakably her mother's, passed down through Maggie's fingers, delicate but unyielding. The Penhurst carriage was dispatched that afternoon. Back at Wexford, the staff changed. The under-butler who had once dismissed Maggie as a bit slow was reassigned. The kitchen maid who'd shielded her from beatings was quietly promoted. A new pianist was hired for future events. But when the prince heard her play, he dismissed her gently. "She plays like she's being watched," he said. He never said whom he wanted instead, but every time he stood at the window and every time a breeze brought song through the air, he listened and remembered. Because though Maggie had left the house, she had never truly left the room. And those who were there that night, those who watched her rise, walk out, and claim her own name, now carried the memory like a mark pressed deep beneath their ribs. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. The girl had not just been seen, she had changed the floorboards beneath them. Years later, Penhurst Estate bore little resemblance to the silent house it had once been. The east wing windows remained open nearly all year round now, sunlight pouring over shelves lined with books instead of porcelain. and the linden trees, once trimmed for appearances, now grew wild with memory. In the old schoolroom, where Lady Agnes had first learned her letters and where Maggie had sat in the corner as an afterthought, children's voices now rang like bells, free and unafraid. No one addressed her as Miss Blythe anymore, unless out of formality. She was simply Maggie to the children she taught, Margaret Eleanor Blythe on the foundations board, and, quietly, in certain letters sealed in royal wax, "My dearest M," from a man who never forgot the sound of her voice. The prince never wed. His name remained tethered to proposals and portraits, but none bore the mark of permanence. He continued his duties, nodded through ceremonies, and made his country proud. But those closest to him knew. His affections had long since fled the ballrooms and sat quietly in a village beyond reach of titles. He visited Penhurst once a year, never with entourage, never formally. He arrived in a simple carriage, walked the same gravel path each time and stayed only for tea. Sometimes Toby joined, sometimes not, but always the conversation was light, and the pauses heavy with the things neither needed to say. When Lady Agnes passed, gently in her sleep, her prayer book still open beside her, it was Maggie who found her. She did not cry, not immediately. Instead, she folded the shawl her mother had once worn and placed it over Agnes's shoulders. That winter, Maggie stood beside Toby, now nearly grown, as he accepted a scholarship under the very name that once barred them from even entering the building. Margaret Blythe Foundation for Orphaned Education. Established in memory of Eleanor Blythe and Agnes Penhurst, no one questioned its origin. The scandal of Wexford had faded into quiet legend, reimagined through whispers and embellished by those who missed the truth when it happened. But for those who were there, the memory lived in gestures. A housekeeper who insisted on calling every girl by her full name, a duke who funded music programs for the poor, a ball where no one laughed when a maid sang. In Maggie's study sat a single framed letter, yellowing now, untouched except by light and time. My Lady Agnes, if you remember Maggie, Magpie, I am still in service and surviving. I do not ask for place or pity, only that if your ladyship might mention me in a way that keeps me safe. It was never sent to the fire because it was never forgotten. And in the smallest room of Penhurst, once a servant's quarters, now her writing room, Maggie would sometimes hum as she worked, unaware that she still sang in the same untrained, perfect pitch that had once stopped a prince's carriage. And still, no one dared mention her name again, but every room remembered her.